slide.
Great.
Just looks great. So I will let Valerie introduce herself because we might make some errors, and I think that you can do it much more efficiently and thoroughly than I can. So if you don't mind, Valerie, we'd love to hear you introduce yourself too.
Yes, great. Well, good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for the invitation. Great to know of all your interests. And I think this focus on, a sustainable future is something that I share very much with all of you. So I'm Dr. Valerie Stull. I'm a faculty associate at the University of Wisconsin here in Madison. I sit in two departments. I sit in the Department of Community and Environmental Sociology, which is fun because I'm not a sociologist. I'm an environmental scientist, but I do mixed methods, kind of interdisciplinary work at the intersection of human health, agriculture, and climate change. And then I also have a position with the Center for Sustainability and the Global Environment over with Jonathan Patz, who I know is a previous speaker of your group. So today I want to share a little bit about one of my research interests in the last decade, which is the use of insects as food and feed and kind of the quest for sustainable protein. So this topic is really fun and kind of integrates a lot of my passions. So what I thought I'd do is give you kind of an overview of why I think insects are a beneficial potential solution to some of our food systems challenges, and then a little snapshot of some of the research I've done in this space. So I want to start with a story, and that is that when I was a PhD student, I got a Fulbright and I spent a year living in Zambia, which is in Southern Africa, down, above South Africa, bordering Botswana and Namibia and Zimbabwe. And while I was there, I was studying food systems and trying to understand insects as food. And I had this experience that totally opened my eyes to how people understand and live with insects. So I was walking through a village one day, and I saw these kids collecting something from the ground and filling their pockets with it. And they were just having a ball, running around, picking something up. And I didn't know what it was. And I finally convinced one little girl to come over and show me what she was collecting. And she opened her hands and showed me these big, juicy flying ants. And these flying ants come out only once per year at the beginning of the rainy season. And in the local language, they're called mafulefute, and they are a snack. And the kids, it was like Christmas Day. I have not seen kids that excited in a long time. And so we sat down together, we took off the wings, and then we pan fried these ants and ate them. And I'm telling you, they taste just like popcorn. They were a very kind of crunchy, oily snack. But the moral of the story is that we have a perception sometimes that insects are a food of desperation and poverty and only something someone would eat as a last resort. And that is absolutely not the case. There is a lot of insect consumption associated with joy and cultural practices. And these little girls were perfectly emblematic of that excitement around this delicacy that only came once per year. So I think we have to take off our American hats and our ideas about what good food is when we think about insects as food. But the reason that I'm so interested in insects as food is because for me, food really matters. It is the primary way in which people are manipulating the surface of the earth. In fact, we use about 40% of ice-free land space for agriculture. So it's the main way that we are changing the surface of the earth. And in the process of doing so, we generate about 30% of human-induced greenhouse gas emissions from the food system. Additionally, we use 70% of our freshwater withdrawals just for agriculture. And I think people are sometimes surprised by this number, given that we have water for all of our houses, for industrial purposes, for swimming pools. But the vast majority of all the fresh water we use and pump is to grow crops and to feed animals. So if I had to, simplify a very complex issue, which is the global food system, I would say that the food system is on the edge. We're really like teetering on the edge of collapse in the sense that it's being pressured on all sides. First of all, the population is growing. We're supposed to be more than 9.8 billion people by 2050. At the same time, we know that climate change is impacting agriculture. It will certainly have a variable impact across the globe, but overall, we expect negative outcomes in our crop yields in the next 50 to 100 years. And that's because we're going to see more pest pressure with climate change, more extreme weather events, droughts, flooding, and storms that all damage our agricultural systems. At the same time, we're already wasting about 1/3 of the food that we produce. In the US, it's more than 40%. So food that is being, all the resources and human power and pesticides and water that's being put into food is totally wasted when that food goes straight into a landfill or is lost, in transport. So that's a huge issue. Sorry, was there a question? Okay, no, just a little feedback. We also, with the growing population, as we have more people on the planet, we have more people also entering the middle class, and those people want to eat those extra delicious, but particularly resource intensive foods like meat and dairy. So we have this shifting demand towards more resource intensive foods. And then we have inequitable distribution of food because we're actually producing more food today than ever before. But I would argue we're producing it using unsustainable practices that drive climate change forward. And we still have a huge number of people around the globe that are not getting enough to eat and remain hungry. So clearly there is a need for what I would call kind of innovative agricultural solutions that protect both human health and the health of the planet and the health of the environment, because agriculture is inextricably linked with the environment and human health. So one such solution that has been proposed is the consumption of insects as food, which is this practice called entomophagy or entomophagy, the practice of eating insects, and actually farming insects as a new agricultural product. We can also use them as animal feed. So I first got interested in this issue more than 10 years ago, in 2013, when the UN's Food and Agriculture Association put out this kind of groundbreaking report arguing that edible insects are one possible solution to securing food and feed security in the future. So I just devoured this report because I was fascinated. I had eaten ants on a trip to Costa Rica with my parents as a kid, but I had never really thought about insects as a farmed food product. And after reading the report, I had more questions than answers. And so there came a dissertation project for me with many research questions to explore. So eating insects is obviously not common for those of us that grew up here in the United States, but we are in the minority when it comes to not eating them, because about 2 billion people in more than 130 countries are living in places where at least some portion of the population regularly consumes insects. And I think there's actually now more than 2,300 known edible species of insects, and those are just the insects we've documented people eating. There's probably a lot more across the globe. If you look at the recorded number of edible insects by species across countries, you can see that China, India, and Mexico really lead the charge with 200 or 300 or more documented species of edible insects in those countries. And I think it's really great that our neighbor to the south, Mexico, has such a wide variety of edible insects that are eaten by different groups in the country. You'll notice that insect consumption is largely a tropical phenomenon, which makes sense when you think about insects as cold-blooded and ectotherms. And if you're in the tropics, you're going to find those insects more frequently throughout the year. And the further north you travel on the globe and the further south, you're going to reach places where it's very cold in the wintertime. So our ancestors probably didn't focus on insects because they weren't a reliable food source year-round. So there's a question, like, why have insects been so integral? Humans have been eating them throughout history across the globe. And one reason for this is that they're just widely abundant. You can find insects no matter where you go on the planet, and they comprise about 1 million of the 1.5 million species that have been described. They're also really nutrient dense. Chimpanzees and early humans probably always ate insects, in part because they're really high in protein and rich in fat. And another part, because some insects are stable in that they live in termite mounds or nests, so you can come back to them day after day. So in these pictures, you can see these guys fishing for termites by putting a stick into a termite mound, and then the soldier termites will grab onto the stick and you pull them off and you just slurp them right off the stick. So that's a lot easier. If you need to eat protein and fat regularly, that's a lot easier than chasing wild game, because that termite mound is always there. So there's good anthropological evidence that insect eating may have contributed to hominid cognitive evolution and us actually getting larger brain sizes, because of that rich nutrient quality of protein and fat in particular. So I want to return to this notion of insect consumption being common across the globe and point out that more than 90% of the insects consumed today are actually wild harvested or foraged from the environment. And this is great because it's a locally available, free resource for folks that need this food. But with wild harvesting, you can't know for sure what an insect has been exposed to. So there are food safety concerns. There have been a few examples of insects, getting contaminated with pesticides or other chemicals that could damage the person who eats them. Also, we have seen examples of ecological damage. So with really valuable edible insects, there's some evidence of people cutting down trees or over harvesting them, which can damage other animals in an ecosystem that also rely on them. And then, of course, if they're wild harvested, they're usually just seasonally available, which may not contribute to year-round nutrition or year-round food security. So that's why I'm personally really interested in farmed insects or mini livestock, tiny livestock, as a way to increase access to insects as food and also as animal feed year round in a context where you can control things and make sure they're safe to eat, and you can also increase the yield of those insects. So there are many reasons to invest in insect farming. First and foremost, insects require significantly less feed than traditional livestock. They have a higher feed conversion efficiency, so they're better at converting food into body mass than cows are, for example. And one reason for this is that insects are cold-blooded, they're ectotherms, so they don't waste calories or energy regulating their body temperature the way that we do and our other livestock do. Also, when you think about feed, you should consider the type of feed that is required. So many insect species are adept recyclers. They can actually convert biomass or materials that is otherwise a waste into something that's very nutritious. So some insects are great at breaking down things like food waste or cattle manure, and there's new data showing that beetle larvae of a few species can actually break down polystyrene or styrofoam. And we aren't sure about these mechanisms. The theory for that is actually it's the microbes in the gut of the insect that are breaking down the plastic, but this could have huge implications for us dealing with waste. And of course, in Wisconsin, we know that dairy farmers really struggle sometimes to manage their manure waste. They're using lagoons, they're trying to process it with biodigesters. It's a huge issue. So there's interest in using insects to deal with these waste streams to convert it into a highly nutritious product that you could then feed to your chickens, or even with processing, maybe even feed to people. Although most people prefer feeding insects for people, food waste streams, things that aren't as don't have any food safety concerns. Also, when we think about waste, we should think about the end product. So chickens and fish also have a high feed conversion efficiency and are really good at converting food into body mass, but you don't eat a whole fish and you don't eat a whole chicken. You can actually eat a whole cricket. You can eat a whole mealworm, and the majority of that is going to be digestible to you. And some of it may be fiber, which we'll talk a little bit more about in a minute. Another consideration with climate change is, of course, water use of animals. And there's some data that shows that producing 1 gram of protein from mealworms, for example, requires 4 to 5 times less water than a same gram of protein for beef. And that's, a very legitimate concern as we look to the future and know that water stress and water security are going to be a challenge for farmers across the globe. Since insects require so much less feed, they also require less land. So we're not clearing land to grow feed for them as much as we would for, say, cattle. And they're a lot smaller. So the amount of land required to produce 1 kilogram of protein with a mealworm compared to beef is substantially lower. And then, of course, you have to think about, the environment that insects need. And some insects are social and they actually like tight confined spaces. So it's very plausible to farm insects vertically without a lot of access to land. So for a long time, I lived in a 1-bedroom apartment here in Madison, and I was farming insects under my kitchen sink because I was doing all these fun little at-home experiments with them. And you don't have to have land to be an insect farmer. It's relatively low tech to do on a small scale. So an argument could be made that it's very accessible, for many people around the world once they learn the tricks of insect farming. In addition to their highly efficient use of natural resources like water and feed, most edible insects also emit significantly fewer greenhouse gases than conventional livestock. So if you look at mealworms and crickets in particular, they don't emit methane, which is that very potent global warming gas. So they have significantly fewer emissions than cattle or swine. And this graph is showing you greenhouse gas equivalents estimated per kilogram of mass gain for these 3 insects, mealworms, crickets, and locusts, and comparing it to animals. And if you look at beef cattle, it's significantly lower. And then insects are very nutrient dense. I like to say that they really pack a punch when it comes to nutrition. Most people talk about them in terms of protein because most species do contain all essential amino acids for human nutrition. So that's those amino acids that our bodies cannot synthesize. But as you can see here, insects are also rich in micronutrient content. This is comparing the house cricket to beef, and you can see that the cricket actually has more zinc, iron, and calcium on a milligrams per kilogram basis than beef, which is something that we think about as being super micronutrient dense. Depending on what your insect has been feeding on, they can also be gluten, soy, nut, and dairy free. So there's an interest among, folks with allergies to look at insects as an alternative protein source compared to like soy protein or whey protein, which comes from dairy. I will talk a little bit more about allergies at the end. They also are known to contain antioxidants and bioactive peptides, which there isn't very much research on yet, but could have potential health benefits for people who consume insects. If we can look at the approximate nutrient content of farmed crickets compared to conventional animal foods, you can see here in the blue that on a as-is kind of raw basis, the crickets have about the same amount of protein as beef and chicken and a little more than eggs. But most people, when they report the nutritional content of insects, are reporting it on a dry weight basis because you will, dry it and grind it into a powder, particularly here in the US. And they're an excellent source of protein on that dry weight basis with 50 to 70% protein in that sense. In terms of fat, they're also comparable to things like, a 93% lean beef. But importantly, the type of fat in some insects is a beneficial fat. We have more polyunsaturated fatty acids or PUFAs, like omega-3s in insects, which of course are beneficial for heart health. And there's some data that we can manipulate the fatty acid content of insects by changing their diets and altering their diets a bit as well. And then for me personally, I think one of the most interesting things about insects is that they contain dietary fiber, unlike any other animal product. And we know that, diets high in fiber are associated with reduced risks of breast cancer and diverticular disease and coronary heart disease. So the average American could definitely have a little more fiber in their diet, and most people around the world could benefit from that as well. So the real hook for me around insects is that there are so many uses for them. We can consume them directly as people. We can process them into animal feed and even pet food. There's several companies in the US now that are making dog treats out of crickets and chicken feed out of black soldier flies. We can use them to reduce waste, and I'm excited about this new research at using them to break down plastics, because that's a huge issue. And then, of course, the insect itself also generates waste, which we call frass, and that can be a good fertilizer. It can be a good bloom stimulant for vegetable production, for example. And then another option for insects is processing them into their component parts, which we could use in different markets. So we could separate out the protein from the fat, from the fiber. And there's an interest in using insect protein in RUTFs, which stands for ready to use therapeutic foods, which are used in situations of acute undernutrition and famine to help improve health and well-being, particularly of children and women. And most of the RUTFs are made with imported products. And so there's an interest in Southern Africa, for example, in increasing insect production and then using that to generate these RUTFs. So this all is really exciting. But I do want to point out, like, it's not all daisies and roses. This is not the silver bullet solution to all of our problems, because it's a really nascent industry. Humans have been farming honeybees, and silkworms for thousands of years. But other than that, we are really just starting to understand domestication and cultivation of insects at scale. So there's a lot we still need to learn. How should we treat insects? I think there are ethical questions about insects as living creatures and how they should be treated. How can we optimize production of insects and profits for producers, without falling into a capitalist trap like we have in other avenues of agriculture, where sometimes we forget about the environmental benefits in favor of just monetary benefits? How can we mitigate risks? If you're growing one insect, you're creating a niche for a little virus or a disease to come in and wipe everything out. So how do we mitigate those risks? And how can we adhere to and push against cultural traditions where appropriate? So I think in the US, we're kind of pushing against the taboo, which is one that doesn't think insects should be eaten. But we don't want to also co-opt traditions and cultures from around the world where insects are a really important part of the diet. And of course, I also think we need to be careful about whose knowledge is being privileged in these conversations about insects, because there are actually farmers in Asia who've been rearing crickets for a really long time. And so American farmers who want to farm crickets should probably be listening to the knowledge and including those folks at the table. So in my work, I think there's on paper, really good evidence that insect farming or insect agriculture and entomophagy, the practice of eating insects, can lead to improved health and well-being with a lower environmental impact than conventional animal products. But there's a really large research gap still. We need to know more about how to optimize mini livestock cultivation, what the direct health impacts of eating insects are, how feasible is it in different contexts, and then how, of course, should it be regulated by the government and other agencies, and where is it going to be most acceptable? So those are all questions I've been thinking about. And I thought you all might be specifically interested in health benefits of insect consumption, so I just wanted to touch on that a little bit more. I do think insects are quite nutritionally advantageous. They are comparable to meat in that they're high in energy and bioavailable protein and fat and low in carbohydrate. There are also some species that are quite good sources of micronutrients like iron and zinc that I mentioned, and others that have, valuable B vitamins like niacin, which is vitamin B3. And if you know the history of pellagra, this niacin deficiency, this may be relevant for folks that eat a lot of unprocessed corn in their diet. Some are a good source of those healthy and unsaturated fatty acids. And then, as I mentioned, they do potentially have antioxidants and bioactive peptides, which could strengthen immune function and potentially lower blood pressure. But this is all speculative. It's like people have identified some antioxidants in insects, but no one has yet tested that theory in people. And then particularly in Chinese medicine, insects are purported to have a lot of medicinal properties. Unfortunately, I haven't found a lot of good research papers written in English about these medicinal properties, and I don't speak Mandarin or Cantonese. So I'm looking forward to more and more cross-cultural engagement on this topic to learn about potential medicinal properties. I do really want to stress, though, everything that I've said here is a generalization. There's thousands of edible insect species, and their nutritional content and properties varies a lot. Even across the life stage of one species, the nutritional value can vary. And then, of course, insects will change in nutritional value according to their diet, just like all the animals that we farm today. Another interesting thing about insects is that they have kind of unique iron. So you may be aware that there's kind of two types of iron. There's non-heme iron and heme-based iron. Non-heme iron is what we find mostly in plants, and heme iron is what we find mostly in animal products. And that tends to be more bioavailable than plant-based iron. But insects have both of these types of iron, heme iron on the cytochromes of the insects and non-heme iron. But there's some data, some lab studies that show that insect iron may be slightly more bioavailable than plant-based iron and even some animal-based iron. And in at least one human intervention trial, the addition of insects to complementary foods for young children, so infants that are transitioning to eat solid foods, actually reduced anemia levels in that population compared to a control. So there is a real interest in insect iron, and particularly supplementing diets in low resource contexts with insects to help prevent anemia among children is an area of interest for public health folks. So I want to talk a little bit about my research now. Are there any questions before I jump into that? That was a crash course in why we care about insects.
Okay.
Go
ahead.
Okay. All right. No questions.
Yeah.
So I was really interested in the fact that potentially 2 billion people around the world are eating insects, but very few studies had actually quantified the impact of eating insects on human health. And I was really interested in this fiber content that I mentioned before, because insects, unlike other animal products, actually contain dietary fiber. So I wanted to know if there are health benefits of cricket consumption specifically beyond that nutritional content. And I was doing this study in the US, so I had a pretty healthy US population for my study. So I did a randomized double-blind control trial where I convinced gullible college students to consume cricket protein at a pretty high dose, 25 grams per day, for 14 days. And then I looked at a bunch of health outcomes, and I also gave them a control, a product without crickets, and compared those two outcomes. So the justification for my study was clear that, insects are really nutrient dense and they are high in fiber. The primary fiber in insects is chitin, which is a component of the exoskeleton, the respiratory lining, the excretory system of the insect. So we all know that chitinous exoskeleton of an insect. So that's the fiber. So I wanted to know, could chitin or other insect fibers be prebiotic? And I'm sure you're familiar with probiotics, which are those beneficial bacteria, but prebiotics are actually the non-digestible food items that promote the growth of probiotics in the gut. So I always say, it's great to take probiotics, but if you don't feed the probiotics in your gut a healthy diet of prebiotics, they're not going to last very long in your gut. So we need these prebiotics. So here's my chemistry nightmares all the time, but basically insects contain a lot of chitin, and there's a thinking that in the process of digestion, they could go through deacetylation and become more soluble and convert into the forms of chitosan and chitin oligosaccharides. This is all to say that oligosaccharides from other food sources are known prebiotics. They feed those good beneficial bacteria. So we think it's possible that insect chitin could serve as a prebiotic in the gut for people who eat insects as a part of their diet. Why do we care about the gut? Well, the gut has 3 times more bacterial cells than we have human cells in our bodies that probably encode about 100 times more genes. And we know that our microbiota in the gut, all those living things, respond to our diet or nutritional cues, and it generates hormone-like signals that influence everything from our physiology and our metabolism to our immune system, to disease progression, to even, mental health and well-being. There's new data about this gut-brain axis. So obviously, it's really important to have good gut health and to support those microbiota the best we can. There were, at the time of my study, no comprehensive clinical studies on the tolerability and impact of eating insects on microbiota. Like, no one had looked at this in human studies at all. So we were very curious, and we viewed this totally as a pilot study because we had nothing to go off of. So just a really quick overview, it was a small pilot study. We did a randomized crossover trial. So each person was their own control. We had 20 healthy adults enroll, and we excluded anyone with any allergies, anyone who was pregnant or breastfeeding, and anyone with any antibiotic use, or like major health conditions. So we had a very predominantly young, healthy population. Our treatment was a commercially available cricket powder, which we got from a company in Canada. And we put it into smoothies and muffins, and we gave everybody 25 grams of it per day during the treatment period. And that was about 8% fiber, the insect fiber. And then we collected from everyone blood samples, stool samples, and a GI questionnaire, because we didn't know how people would tolerate, these are Americans who are not used to eating insects, how they would tolerate the consumption of insects. So here's just a little diagram of the study, but basically we collected data at baseline, then everybody was randomized to either get the cricket breakfast or a control breakfast. Then there was a washout period and they switched to the other treatment. And then we collected data again at end line. So this is a very common methodology for studying changes in the microbiota in the gut. So I'm jumping just quick to results. The most interesting finding that we had was that there was a 5.7-fold increase relative to control in the probiotic species Bifidobacterium animalis. So we saw an increase in the abundance of this probiotic in the guts of people after they ate the cricket diet. And Bifidobacterium animalis is one of the best studied probiotics. You can find it in yogurts. It's known to inhibit pathogens. And there's a commercial strain of this, which has been studied a lot in clinical trials, which can help improve gastrointestinal function, protect against diarrhea, reduce side effects from antibiotics, and increase resistance to respiratory infections. So we're very interesting slew of potential health benefits from having a higher abundance of this probiotic in the gut. And to our knowledge, this was the first time a whole food with chitin had shown bifidogenic properties in people. So this was the first time, a first study that showed, and I'm not showing you all these results, but the first study that showed that cricket consumption was safe at our study dose. We actually didn't have anyone drop out of our study, which is very rare in a clinical intervention trial. And we did see some prebiotic effects. As I just mentioned, we saw the increase in the abundance of a probiotic species that we really understand. Now, a bunch of other things happen that we don't fully understand because we don't know about all the different species of microbiota in the gut. We also saw, there was a potential benefits to gut health and inflammation in that we saw decreases in systemic TNF-alpha, which is a cytokine that's associated with inflammation. So that was an interesting finding. We also saw a slight change in a liver enzyme, which is also associated with inflammation. So these, again, were happening in healthy adults. So we can't read too much into it, but we saw a lot of interesting potential changes. So the real takeaway, I think, is that we need to do more research because potentially 2 billion people are eating insects that could be influencing their microbiome. Since our study was published in 2018, there have been more recent laboratory in vitro and animal studies that have all also demonstrated prebiotic effects from insects and chitin and their derivatives. So I think the narrative continues to be that insect fiber could be beneficial for gut health. We are currently running a follow-on study right now at Colorado State University with my collaborator, Dr. Tiffany Weir. So this time, instead of giving people 25 grams of whole insects, we're giving them 4 grams of isolated insect fiber. And we're giving it to a population that has IBS. So people that have IBS are chronically inflamed. They chronically have gut inflammation. So the idea is that we're giving them just the fiber and they're already inflamed. So any impact of that fiber will be heightened so we can see it better. And we can, try and understand this mechanism of action. Because like I said, we think that insect chitin may be converted through digestion into this more soluble form that's a prebiotic, but we're not sure. So we're really excited. And I think we've got 16 people that have almost finished the study. We lost 2, but that's not too bad, especially in an IBS population where they're, very sensitive to what they eat. And we are giving them 4 grams a day of insect chitin. So I'm very excited to have those results this summer. So if you want to read this study and all the details that I did not give you, it was published in Scientific Reports in 2018. So please feel free to read it. Another research question that I had was, it's great that insects may confer health benefits, but what is the impact on a more population public health scale? Like, what if we really ramp up insect farming, we make insects more available, and we had just a small amount in the diet of more people? What would be the public health impact? So I worked with some modelers at Harvard University, and we ran a study to answer this question, kind of looking at what would happen if you altered food availability in a country and added insects as a part of the daily diet, and then compared the health outcomes with those that didn't have insects in the daily diet. So it was a modeling study, but we found some really kind of interesting and exciting outcomes that just 5 grams per day. So remember, I gave people 25 grams of insect, which is a lot and very hard to disguise. 5 grams per day could yield 67 million fewer people at risk of protein deficiency across the regions that are highlighted on this map. It could yield 166 million fewer people at risk of zinc deficiency and 237 million fewer people at risk of folate deficiency, which most of you know may be associated with neural tube defects in children. So having more folate in the diet, particularly pregnant women, is really beneficial for public health. So this is like huge numbers of people that maybe could be moved out of these nutritional deficiency risk zones just by having 5 grams per day of insects, like a small handful or less of insects. So to me, again, this is saying we need more research on human health impacts. Like if we're really going to invest in insects as a more sustainable protein compared to livestock and one that's more resilient to climate change, it's worth understanding these health impacts better. And if you want to read this study, it was published in Environmental Research Letters with my colleagues at Harvard, Matt Smith and Sam Myers. Jonathan Betts also on this one. So clearly there are nutritional gains and potential health benefits from eating insects, but we really need more data. I did a review paper on edible insects a couple years ago, and I found only 15 papers, written in English at least, that gave people insects and looked at health impacts. So there's been a long-standing bias against insects as food in Western health science. And I think that's changing now. But the fact that people have been eating insects throughout history, throughout the globe, and there are only 15 studies on the health impacts of doing so is kind of astounding. We have actually a lot more data on what's inside insects. There's a lot of data like quantifying the nutritional content. And that's because it's easier, right? It's easier to measure protein than it is to get all the approvals and the money to run an intervention where you give people a food. That's very expensive. So I'm really hoping that my work and some work of my colleagues will spur kind of a bunch of new research, which is happening even since that review was published. There have been new studies, human intervention studies on insects as food. I do want to say that optimizing the environmental benefits and the nutritional gains of insects is harder than it looks, because farming insects is not always super easy. They are incredibly resilient, and they have secret superpowers that we haven't fully uncovered, like what's happening in the guts of insects that lets them break down things that we can't break down. But we can't assume that we will be able to, optimize production of insects using waste streams like overnight. We've been domesticating other animals for 9,000 years, and here we are just really getting started with insects today. So, so my research group here at UW, we had this idea that, well, what if we used crop residues to feed insects? So in Wisconsin, we have a lot of corn production. So what if after we harvest the corn grain, we have the stover left over, which is the stem and the cob and the leaves? What if we ground that up and fed it to mealworms? How would they do? So we found that the mealworms could live on the corn stover, but their growth speed and performance went down because it's not a very nutrient dense feed substrate. It doesn't have very much nitrogen in it, especially once it turns brown. And so it wasn't an optimal feed for them, although they could survive on it. So our second step was, well, what if we grew mushrooms on this crop residue and let the mushrooms kind of break down the lignins for us and, concentrate nutrition, and then we fed that to insects. And then maybe we could harvest some of the mushrooms too for human consumption. And that was interesting too, because we saw that the particular mushroom we picked and the particular insect that we picked didn't really jive. And so the crickets didn't do great on this mushroom substrate. But we only tested one insect species and one type of mushroom. So I think there's so much potential to use waste streams to feed insects, because in my mind, it doesn't make sense to feed insects human food if the goal is to improve nutrition, particularly in resource poor, food insecure contexts. So I'm really interested in using waste streams to feed insects, but it's tricky. It's not really an easy task, and so we need more research there. I did want to get back to this allergy risk, because this is something people always ask me about. So insects are arthropods, right? And there are allergy risks of consuming them. There are antigenic determinants conserved across arthropods. So people who have very strong dietary shellfish allergies are often allergic to insects. So if I give an event in person, I often bring snacks for people to try, but I don't recommend anyone with a shellfish allergy partake, especially if it's like a really extreme allergy, like you have an EpiPen or something, because in rare cases, people are also allergic to insects. Also, we know that people who work in insectaries and farm insects regularly can develop kind of an asthma response. And that's because little pieces of insects contain chitin, that fiber, which is an allergen when it gets into your lungs. So, we recommend that people who work with insects a lot actually wear personal protective equipment like a mask or a respirator. So certainly there are risks to eating insects, just as with any other food. I don't think the risk of allergies is any higher than in most other foods or food safety concerns with insects. We should treat them like meat. We should process them the way we process meats to ensure food safety. So getting towards the end here, I just want to point out, you're probably thinking, this is interesting, but like Americans probably not super excited about eating insects. Like you might be kind of grossed out, which is okay, because that's part of our cultural food norms. We have a real aversion to eating insects in Western contexts. And I think the part of this is due to a history of ethnocentrism and othering. And by that, I mean this idea that when colonists arrived in new places historically from European countries, they found people there eating differently than how they ate. And they viewed their culture and their way of doing things as superior. So it was very easy to decide that this food is inappropriate, it's disgusting, it's uncivilized, and therefore we are othering this other culture's type of food. So I think there's a strong history of, viewing our own way of eating as superior. Also, we have a real cultural taboo with insects, in part because of a good reason, which is that we view insects as pests that can transmit diseases. And that is true in some cases, but the vast majority of insects that are consumed around the world are not, real big perpetrators of transmitting disease. But I don't know if you all remember this old show, Fear Factor, that was on years ago, but they always used insects and cultural insects like spiders as a fear-inducing strategy. So we have this cultural taboo around it. We also, at least here in Wisconsin, live lives very separate from insects. We've got screens on all our windows. We have doors that seal very tightly. We are very ecophobic. If you find a insect in your house, what do? You immediately kill it, and then you call it an exterminator, right? I lived in the tropics for a while in Zambia, and very few people have screens on their doors. People just live much more integrated with nature and with animals. And so there's just a little bit less ecophobia, I think, in the tropics than here in the US. And then I mentioned this before, there's also this, history of evolution and the diet. So our hominid ancestors that migrated to northern latitudes could not rely on insects in the dead of winter because they were not readily available. And so they put their effort into wild game and root vegetables that could be stored over the winter. So it makes sense that tradition didn't carry on in northern latitudes the way that it does in the tropics, even to today. But I will say that food culture really does change, and it changes pretty quickly. So I don't know if you all remember when soy milk became a thing, but it was a while ago. And now you can get a soy latte at any coffee shop in Madison. But initially, there was a lot of pushback against soy products, tofu, soy milk. But now, because of, health claims, whether you agree with them or not, soy has really become a normal part of the American diet for a lot of people. The same is true of sushi. Sushi was initially really viewed as disgusting, but then it trickled into the coast, right? You would find sushi in New York and San Francisco. And now you can get sushi at a gas station in Nebraska, right? Don't eat that sushi. It's not good to eat, but it's there. And that's because food culture and food perceptions does change. And all of a sudden, sushi went from being disgusting to being like elite, right? Sushi is kind of this elite food. I'll also just mention the historical transformation of lobster, which on the East Coast was actually so abundant that it was viewed as a poor person's food and a prison food fed to prisoners in the United States. And now, it's a delicacy, it's expensive, it's less prominent. And what is lobster but a giant cricket in the ocean? Really? Like, it's an arthropod. Look at a cricket, look at a lobster. So food culture absolutely does change. And there are a lot of chefs in North America really playing around with insects. There's kind of two schools of thought. One is we're going to hide insects, use insect protein powder and put it in something else. And then there's let's display insects and, feature them as like this interesting ingredient. I will say that the Seattle Mariners baseball team, I'm not sure if they are still doing it, but they were selling chapulines, which is this Mexican spiced grasshopper. It's a traditional Mexican street food. They were selling it at baseball games in Seattle. And that's like the most American sport, right? Baseball. And they were selling out every game because chapulines are delicious. And they're spicy and they're served hot. And it's like food culture can change, and it is changing slowly. There are a ton of companies in North America now selling insect-based products. I will say the majority of them are cricket-based. So we kind of joke in the industry that crickets are the gateway bug instead of the gateway drug, because crickets are cute, but not too cute. We're familiar with them. But we don't love them the way we love butterflies and ladybugs. So like we're kind of okay eating them. So it's a really interesting thing where crickets and mealworms are really the two main insects being farmed for human food in Western contexts. But the tide is changing really quickly. And Richard had mentioned before we started the talk that he'd seen something about insects spelled with a Y, this French company. There are a ton of investments right now in insect farming facilities or insect production facilities around the globe. Barclays is interested. We have a brand new company opening a farm, the largest insect farm in the world, probably in Illinois, called the Nova Feed. And most of these investments are happening on the feed side. So farming insects, using waste streams to feed to animals. And I do think that is where the change will happen in the US the quickest. It's going to be us actually supplanting or replacing other ingredients in fish food and chicken feed with insects that are more sustainable than those other protein sources in the future. So even if you're still not ready to eat insects, I think you can be supportive of insects in the food system as a part of fish feed, animal feed, things like that. We have a brand new working group at UW-Madison. Our Black Soldier Fly or BSF working group is in the process. We just got a grant. So we're in the process of establishing an on-campus colony of black soldier flies to help address food waste. So we're going to use food waste from campus to farm insects on campus. So dealing with our food waste and then running a bunch of experiments with those insects to understand the energy efficiency of the system, how those insects as a feed ingredient affect the quality of eggs from laying hens. You know, we have a poultry research center right on campus as well. We're also going to look at a lot of potential benefits and think about if insect farming is really viable in the Wisconsin context. Like, could a farmer, for example, that has cattle, dairy cattle, could they use insects to deal with their manure right on the farm and then sell their insects to the poultry farmer down the road, for example? So there could be some really interesting kind of circular economy models using insects. So here's just a little graphic of our research or our design for this project at UW, you know, playing with waste streams, rearing insects on campus, and then studying their component parts and the uses of them in livestock, or sorry, in chicken feed and fish feed. There's quite a bit of aquaculture in Wisconsin, which I didn't realize, but fish farming in Wisconsin would also be a really good target market for black soldier flies that have been reared on these waste streams. So just to end, if you're still feeling uncomfortable with the idea of putting a cicada in your mouth, for example, I don't think you'd have to eat insects to make a difference, but we should practice this theory of don't yuck my yum, because insects are actually a really important part of food cultures around the world. And it's okay for us to not want to eat them, but we shouldn't disparage them. Because as the scholar Heather Lowy says, she said, to embrace the idea of entomophagy or eating insects is to embrace in our bodies and our minds and souls the full humanity of other classes, races, and cultures. And I really like that because, you know, if you really gut check it, what is your reaction to insects? Why is it that way? And do you have to react that way? I don't think you do. So here are your six-legged take-home messages. Insects are totally legitimate food that can be reared with a lower environmental impact than conventional livestock. They don't require very much land. They're pretty low tech, and they can be farmed in resource-limited areas. There are more than 2,000 known species to consider for both human food and animal feed. They have the potential to recycle food waste and other wastes for us. They provide lots of great nutrients, including dietary fiber that could boost health. And I don't think they are a silver bullet, but we're just scratching the surface of potential benefits from insects to planetary health and human health. And then I just want to add that out of all of this research, I have started a few years ago a nonprofit organization called the Mission to Improve Global Health Through Innovation. We are working with women in rural contexts of Zambia, and one of our main projects is going to be climate smart micro farming, tiny farms using insects. And in Zambia, insect consumption, as I showed you the picture of the little girls with the flying ants, is culturally appropriate and common, but no one is farming them. And so our idea is to work with women's groups who are really interested in insect farming as a new livelihood activity and a way to promote health and nutrition in these kind of low income areas. And I have an amazing team in Zambia that I've known for years that is working with these women. And it's really exciting to see kind of research turn into practice, into something that's meaningful. So if you're interested in Mighty at all, let me know, or I put the website here on the slide. So I will just say thank you for listening for so long, and I would be happy to answer any questions.
Wow, that was fabulous, Valerie. We really appreciate that. It's so wide-ranging a talk. I will pick up we have some lots of questions in the chat. Before I open that, could I ask you what a black soldier fly looks like? I'm not familiar with the fly.
Oh, yes. So they are, I think I had a picture on the slide, but they are a little bit longer and skinnier than like a house fly.
Okay.
But you will see them in Wisconsin. They are native to southern parts of the US, so you'll see them in Florida a lot. They are not pests of human dwellings. So they don't live very long as adult flies, and they don't feed as adults. So what they're doing is finding a pile of waste where they can lay their eggs so that the babies, the larvae, can be born and consume that before they become adults. But they're really cool. I think they have such superpowers because they have really strong appetites as larvae, and they can break down almost anything. And there's also evidence that they can actually remediate risks in food waste, like biological risks and pesticide risks, through the process of eating them. And yeah, I can send you a picture. I think there might have been one on the slides, but yeah, they're black. They're slightly longer and skinnier than a housefly. Yeah.
Okay, very
Or
good.
Can I ask, Valerie, can I ask, does one eat the actual black fly, or do you eat the larva?
So the larva, most edible insects, the larva is the most nutritious phase. So actually the most consumed insects in the world are beetles, Coleoptera, and people tend to eat the larva of the beetles. And with the black soldier flies, you also eat the larva. Although I will say black soldier flies are predominantly produced for animal feed, not for human consumption. Although there is some interest in having them for human consumption as well.
Okay.
Good
Well,
question.
we have lots of questions here. Let's start off at the top with a question that came early on in your talk. How is chitin nutritious? Why is it so?
Yeah.
So
So interestingly enough, chitin is a fiber, and fiber is really important to our health, but it may not technically be considered a nutrient. Because your body doesn't really digest it. It's the microbes in your gut that digest fiber. So we don't know for sure, but that's what my research is trying to understand is that chitin, through the process of digestion, being modified in such a way that it's a good food for the bacteria, the microbes in our gut. And we know that those microbes confer health benefits. Those beneficial microbes confer health benefits for us. They help boost our immune system. They improve our metabolism. They improve gut health, which allows you to better absorb nutrients in your diet. And there's some data of chitosans and different derivatives of chitin from mushrooms conferring health benefits, like lowering cholesterol or lipids in the blood, because they can bind those fats. So it's not a nutrient, but it has nutritional implications. So I hope that.
good. I think that captures it. Lee has a couple of questions. The first one is the World Economic Forum is trying to push everyone to consume insects. But interestingly, when they have their meetings in Davos, they eat steak and seafood. Why are they not leading the way by choosing to eat insects if they're so tasty and climate friendly?
Well, hypocrisy reigns supreme sometimes. I will say I have eaten a lot of edible insects in many countries in my work and travels, and some of them I really like, and some of them are very hard for me because it is a texture and a flavor I am not used to. So I think there is a challenge just with anything. If you didn't grow up eating it and it's a really different flavor and texture, there is a challenge in feeling excited about eating that. So we do need to work to make them delicious. There is actually a museum of disgusting foods in Sweden that highlights foods that are perceived as disgusting outside of their home context. And they have many insect dishes there. But funny enough, they also have root beer. Root beer, something that we all probably drank as kids, is perceived as very disgusting by people in other contexts. And if you next time you taste root beer, taste it with an open mind, and you will realize that it tastes like mouthwash. It really does. And so for folks not used to it, it is disgusting. So another point is that the best way to eat an insect is fresh. And it is hard in a European context to get a fresh insect because very few people are farming them. So what you're getting are dried insects, same as here in the US. And it's like comparing beef jerky to steak sirloin. They're from the same animal, but they are not the same food, right? They don't taste the same at all. They're different products. So there's a challenge in making them delicious. And I don't know about the World Economic Forum's practices or what they're saying in their events, but I will say that there is still a big hurdle to overcome. Even people who think insects are a good idea struggle with the ick factor that we may have about them. And then this issue of we're not really getting fresh, delicious, culturally like traditional dishes with insects. We're getting something else when you eat them in the US or Europe.
Maybe if we use a halfway introduction of lobster, I sure love lobster. So
yeah, yeah, I think that it's always like, yeah, lobster really is kind of a cricket in the ocean. So.
Lee asks another question. Historically, how technologically advanced are countries that traditionally eat insects versus countries where they don't? Does that suggest anything about brain development is influenced by diet?
I don't know if I can speak to this question very well. Yeah, because there's so many variables and historical variables that influence the technological developments.
I think so too. That's a tough one.
That's a tough one. Good question.
Don't know. Steve asked a question. You tested adults. Are there any different effects and or benefits to children? Might be a little tricky to test yet, but have you done any studies?
Yeah, so I haven't done any studies in kids yet, but the study that I mentioned about iron and anemia reduction was done in small children where they supplemented the diet with insects and saw this reduction in anemia. And I'll also note that I am currently part of a study that just received its initial funding happening in Madagascar, which is one of the poorest countries in the world. It is a context where people do eat insects traditionally. And we are trying to add insects to a school feeding intervention where they're giving kids beans and rice. And we're trying to add insects to help supplement that lunch and help improve health outcomes for kids. So we're right now going through the process of all the important safety things we need to do to test insects in children. And really, we're interested in anemia and also gut inflammation, because in those low resource contexts, we have something called environmental enteropathy, which is chronic inflammation due to like parasites and consuming, having unsafe water. So it's a really important question that I'm very invested in answering, because if there were a lot of benefits to children from a very low dose of insects, that could be huge. Yeah.
That's a great place to test it. Thank you for telling us about that. Jeff asks, is there a difference nutritionally between eating whole insects or insect powder?
Yeah, so it really depends how the insect powder has been processed. In some cases, they hydrolyze the protein, which means they're separating out the protein from the fiber. So in those cases, we actually think the protein from insects can be more bioavailable because none of it is bound up in the fiber, but then you may miss the nutritional benefits of the fiber, as I just mentioned, as potentially being good food for probiotics. So it really depends on how it's processed. It's just like with any food, you can have these leafy greens that are super nutrient dense, but then you boil them in water and you pour off the water and you've lost a lot of the water soluble vitamins, for example, that were in that food. So the processing can affect nutritional value. But I would say insect powder is comparable to other protein powders in nutritional composition.
Thank you. This question is you may have partially answered, but it's a good one to touch on again. Doug asks, is flavor an important consideration in which insects are edible, or are other factors more important than flavor?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the list of edible insects is actually made based on a historical use of an insect by a human population. So no one is out there like picking a random insect and saying, look, you can eat this one. We are only documenting them based on people actually eating them in the real world. And I can tell you that the folks that I've talked to who wild forage for insects are doing it based on flavor and availability. So it doesn't make sense to eat an insect where there are a few of them and it would take a ton of effort to collect them. So instead, you're eating grasshoppers that you can attract with a light at nighttime, and they hit the light and they slide down your little slide into a bucket of water, and you did nothing, and now you have grasshoppers to eat, which is great. So I think it's flavor and availability. Interestingly enough, I did ask some of my colleagues in Zambia, well, how did you know, like, how did your ancestors know what to eat? Like, which ones were good to eat? And they told me that sometimes, because there are poisonous insects, obviously, they would feed them first to dogs.
Oh my.
And I was like, that's really interesting. Like, they were like, oh, this looks good. Let's feed it to the dog. And if the dog survives, then we can eat it. But that's just an anecdote from a friend.
That's great. I'm personally enjoyed your letter, but I really enjoying your question answering. You answer questions so nicely, and I find it really fun to listen to your questions answers. I have a little quick question. I'd like to know, if it's okay, the name of your collaborator at Colorado State.
Yes, Dr. Tiffany Weir, W-E-I-R. And she's a nutritional biochemist, which is great because her expertise is the microbiome. And I am not a microbiologist. I'm a food systems environmental scientist. So it was essential that we partnered together to do this clinical intervention study, because she knows what's going on in the gut with the microbiome, and she's fantastic. She was actually my mentor as an undergraduate, and now we are collaborators, which is really
great.
fun.
My daughter lives in Fort Collins. She might like to meet her.
It's the best. I love Fort Collins. Yeah.
Okay. Let's see if there are any other questions here.
There are a few people raising their hands too, I think.
Okay. Let's see.
Dorothy.
Okay,
Yes.
let's let people raising their hand. Dorothy, go ahead.
Well, my question, and you partly answered it. I was thinking that the protein powders, even if they're removed from fiber and some of the vitamins, protein powders are very in for all kinds of smoothies and things. Is there an inroad in Western societies for having that available as an affordable protein as opposed to sort of a niche market?
Right. That's a great question. Yeah. And actually, it took me 6 years, but I convinced my mom to eat crickets. But the only way I could do it was by putting protein powder in a smoothie or in a bread. That's how I eat insects the most, is I just add a little bit when I make bread or to a smoothie. But that's how I got my mom to eat crickets, because that was how she was comfortable. But yeah, there are several US and Canadian companies making food grade crickets, growing food grade crickets. And then a lot of other food companies are taking those crickets and processing them into powders and putting them into products. Unfortunately, right now, the price point is still much, much higher than whey or soy, which is just so cheap to produce currently. So unfortunately, it's still in the US a niche upscale protein option that's not widely available. I've tried to get Willie Street Co-op to start carrying insects. It's been a few years. I should go back to them and see if they'll carry insect powder. But it's hard to find that market. And that several companies have also opened, kind of trying to reach the paleo diet people, because insects are very paleo. Our ancestors were definitely eating them. But that the two companies I know of didn't succeed that tried to do that. So right now, it's just there's not enough producers to be competitive with soy and whey, but that is absolutely where a lot of the companies are going, is the protein powder in smoothies and things like that.
Thank you.
Good. Doug asks a question. Why are houseflies not included in the list of edible insects? They can cover the outside of a house when they hatch out.
Well, again, that list is based on insects that people are consuming, people have consumed. And so people, houseflies are a pest of human dwellings. And I think, people probably have a negative association with them for that reason, in part. And so, yeah, they just historically no one has picked them up. But there is, there's an interest now. People, particularly people on the feed side who are studying black soldier flies, are looking now at other fly species, because flies have a lot of interesting properties that other insects maybe don't have, and they have short lifespans and things like that. So there's definitely an interest in looking beyond the species that we know right now. But yeah, I think people are also leaning towards bigger insects. Like if you think about, again, wild harvesting something, grasshoppers are really big, and easy to collect. Those flying ants that I showed you are big and juicy, so there's something about ease to collect and amount of mass that you get at the end of the day.
Well, I think we also need to learn from birds. Birds migrate in the spring to areas where there are a lot of caterpillars, harvesting at the time that they have young, because the birds know that caterpillars are the most nutritious way to feed their young.
Yes.
And so we can follow the birds.
Yeah, and caterpillars are very widely consumed. There's a Mopani caterpillar you can find across southern and central Africa, that you can even get canned Mopani caterpillars in Europe, because there's so many African diaspora living in Europe that want those caterpillars. So there's like a big trade of these for, a portion of the population that wants them. Those are the ones that I really have trouble eating, by the way. They are very distinct in texture and flavor, and I just cannot get over it, even though I'm very pro eating them.
Can you describe the flavor a little bit? What is it like? Does it have?
So people tell me it's barbecue chicken. When I taste it, it's tree.
It's what?
It tastes like a tree.
Like a tree. Okay.
Yeah, like it's just very woody and kind of, but a lot of people describe it as barbecue chicken, but that is not what I taste.
Oh, that's great. I just remind people, if you want to look back in some of the earlier things we talked about, this is a book that that we did enjoy a little bit. If you can see it there, it's called Technically Food: Inside Silicon Valley's Mission to Change What We Eat. Now, this isn't specifically insects. They're talking about growing beef and culture and that sort of thing. But there are all ways that we can change our diet and cut back on the use of live beef and beef food. So that all has a positive effect. And we did talk about that a couple of years ago. But this is really a very special talk. I'm thoroughly pleased that Dottie thought of inviting you, Valerie, and answering your questions, I really enjoy.
Great.
Any other thoughts or questions out there?
Oh, I think there's one.
I have one. I have one.
Okay, Doug, go ahead.
So you talked about barbecue chicken. I would have just assumed that you could have poured barbecue sauce on these things and they would have tasted great, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm assuming, I mean, that's what I do when I'm eating something that I don't really like.
Yeah.
You put something on it that completely covers up its flavor.
Right. Exactly. Yeah, and in our study, we were giving people this really high dose of crickets, and crickets have kind of a nutty, earthy flavor, I would say. And so we used chocolate malt as a flavored, because we were trying to disguise it so they didn't know if they had the cricket or the placebo, the alternative. And it was hard to disguise. It also has a distinct texture, but we use very strong flavors to kind of disguise this nutty, earthy flavor of some insects for sure.
That's great. Other people with their hands up that I haven't seen. Anybody out there? Well, I've just enjoyed this, and I imagine many of you have, most of you have, and I'm really glad for your contribution. I'll just remind people that next week we'll have Neil Alexander as our guest speaker. He's from Canada. He's spoken to us twice before about nuclear energy in Canada, and this time he's going to focus on the Great Lakes and some of the bad ideas and bad science that led to bad decisions in nuclear energy. This is coming in the fore a great deal now to look back and see where we've made mistakes with nuclear energy and how we need to correct them. But all these things are useful. I especially like today's talk because there are things that we can personally do, and that's a real challenge. We can't always be driving electric cars if we don't have if we drive long distances and can't be plugging them in all the time. But changing your diet is pretty easy to do when you go to the grocery store. So thank you so much, Valerie. We really appreciated your talk today.
Yeah, it was great to chat with all of you, and I hope to hear from some of you. Feel free to email me if you have questions. Yeah, and just I think what we can all do also is just have an open mind about other food cultures and realize there may be lots of benefits from the way other people eat as well.
Okay. Well, thanks again, everyone, for coming,
Thank you.
and especially Valerie. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Have a great
Great
day.
job.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Yeah.
Very complete and informative.
Great. I'm so glad to hear that. Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.